At 11:52 on the night before her cousin's rehearsal dinner, my ex-girlfriend sent me a single text that said, "The dock! 20 minutes!" And I was foolish enough to go. By 12:15, we were standing at the end of Miller Lake, moonlight lying flat across the water the way it always had, and she was telling me that the engagement everyone in town had been whispering about wasn't real. She had let people believe it for 4 months. Nobody had corrected them, not even her. My name is Eli Sawyer. I was 28 that summer, running my father's contracting business out of a lake town small enough that everyone's business became public property within a week. I built decks, replaced roofs, and occasionally got called out to fix things that didn't actually need fixing because somebody wanted an excuse to talk to me. I had gotten used to being talked about. 14 months earlier, the woman standing across from me on that dock had left for a culinary residency in Florence with 11 days of notice, and everyone in Pine Hollow had an opinion about what that meant for me. Her name was Maren Voss. She was 27, made pastries good enough that the local bakery still put her name on the specials board, even though she hadn't worked a shift there in over a year, and she had a habit of noticing things about people that they hadn't noticed about themselves. We met in high school, dated on and off through community college, and settled into something steady by the time we were 24. I thought we were building towards something permanent. She thought she was disappearing into a life that had never once asked her what she wanted. The residency offer came on a Tuesday. She left on the following Saturday. I found out the flight number from her mother, not from her, because Maren had decided that a clean break was kinder than a long goodbye. I disagreed. I still disagree. But I understood, eventually, that a person who feels trapped will sometimes choose the exit that hurts the least to walk through, even if it's the one that hurts everyone else the most. Since then, I had built a version of myself that didn't ask for things. I dated carefully, ended things before they could end me, and told my best friend Callum that I was fine every single time he asked, which was often because Callum had watched me stop returning phone calls for 3 weeks after she left, and had never quite trusted my definition of fine again. Maren came back to Pine Hollow 10 days before her cousin Bridget's wedding, staying at her parents' place on the north side of the lake. I found out from my mother, who found out from the church bulletin, which is how information traveled in a town our size. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that for 6 days, until I ran into her buying charcoal at the hardware store and had to stand in the checkout line while she asked about my father's knee, and I asked about Florence, both of us performing a normalcy that fooled absolutely nobody standing near the register. We ran into each other twice more that week. Once at the gas station, where she was filling up her mother's car, and I was filling up my truck, and neither of us managed more than a nod and a comment about the weather before both of us found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. The second time was at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, and that one lasted longer than either of us intended. I was buying tomatoes from a stand my mother swore by when I heard her voice behind, asking the vendor about peaches the exact same way she used to ask about them every summer we were together, testing 3 before choosing one. "You're still particular about produce," I said, without turning around. "You're still buying tomatoes from Doreen instead of growing your own, even though you build decks for a living and could easily build a garden bed. I don't have time for a garden bed. You have time to argue about tomatoes with a woman you haven't spoken to in over a year." That landed somewhere between a joke and an accusation, and neither of us quite knew how to follow it. We stood there for a minute, the market crowd moving around us, both of us holding produce we no longer cared about, until she finally asked how my father's business was doing, and I asked how Florence had treated her, and we managed 4 full minutes of conversation before she excused herself toward the flower stand, leaving me standing there wondering why 4 minutes had felt like more than the entire 14 months before it. I told Callum about it that night over beers on his porch, and he gave me the same look he'd been giving me since high school whenever I mentioned her name, equal parts concern and resignation, like he already knew how the story would go and was just waiting for me to catch up. Then, at 11:52 on a Thursday night, my phone lit up with her name for the first time in 14 months. The dock, 20 minutes. No explanation. No apology for the silence before it. Just an invitation shaped exactly like every reckless decision I'd ever made where she was involved. I told myself I wasn't going to go. I put on shoes anyway. The walk to Miller Lake took me past the old boat launch and the gravel turnoff where teenagers still parked to avoid their parents, past the tree line that opened onto the public dock her family had used for 3 generations. The night was warm enough that my shirt stuck to my back before I'd gone half a mile, and I spent most of the walk rehearsing things I planned to say, and none of the things I actually said once I got there. She was already on the dock when I arrived, sitting with her legs hanging over the edge, a canvas bag beside her that I recognized because it used to live in my truck. You still have that, I said, nodding at the bag. You still walk everywhere instead of driving 3/4 of a mile, she said. Some things don't change. Some things do. I noticed. She looked up at me, and there was something careful in her expression, like she'd practiced this moment as many times as I had and still hadn't landed on the right opening line. Thank you for coming. You didn't give me much choice. The dock. 20 minutes. That's not an invitation. That's a summons. Would you have come if I'd asked nicely? Probably not. Then it worked. I sat down beside her, close enough to feel the old pull of familiarity and far enough to pretend I wasn't feeling it. Behind us, carved into the trunk of the oak that leaned out over the water, our initials were still visible if you knew where to look. E+M inside a lopsided heart neither of us had been skilled enough to carve straight. We'd put it there the summer we were 16, using my father's pocket knife and about 4 minutes of courage between us. It's still there, she said, following my gaze. I checked before you showed up. Sentimental. Observant. There's a difference. I let the silence sit for a moment, the lake making its usual quiet sounds around us, before I asked the question that had been circling since I got her text. Why now, Maren? 14 months of nothing, and suddenly it's the dock. 20 minutes. Her jaw tightened slightly. Because I'm tired of everyone in this town looking at me like I'm engaged to a man they've never met. That stopped me. You're not engaged? I never was. There's a ring. My mother saw a ring. There's a ring my roommate's brother gave someone else at a dinner. I happened to be sitting near, and a photo that got shared before anyone bothered to ask me a single question. She exhaled hard, frustration and exhaustion both audible in it. I let it stand for months, because correcting it meant explaining why I cared what people here thought of me, and I wasn't ready to explain that. And now you are? Now I'm sitting on a dock at midnight with the person I actually wanted to explain it to. I studied her in the low light, trying to decide whether 4 months of silent rumor and 14 months of real silence, before that had earned her the right to say something like that to me so plainly. I decided it hadn't. Not entirely, but I also wasn't going to pretend my chest hadn't done something complicated when she said it. You could have called, I said. Any of the last 14 months would have worked. I know. That's it, you know? What do you want me to say, Eli? That I was a coward? Fine. I was a coward. I left because staying felt like disappearing, and then I stayed away because coming back felt like admitting I'd made a mistake, and admitting that felt worse than the guilt of not calling. Her voice had gone quiet, stripped of the performance from a few minutes earlier. I'm not proud of it. I'm just telling you the truth, because you drove yourself crazy for a year wondering, and you deserve better than more silence. I didn't have a clean response to that. I'm not sure one exists. So instead, I reached into the bag beside her, more to give my hands something to do than out of real curiosity, and found 2 towels, 2 bottles of water, and nothing that resembled a swimsuit for either of us. You didn't bring suits, I said. No, Maren. We used to swim here at midnight without them when we were 17 and significantly worse at hiding from your father's flashlight. We were also 17. This feels different. Everything about tonight is different. That's sort of the point. She stood, brushing off her shorts, and looked down at me with an expression I remembered from 100 small dares she'd issued over the years, the kind that always ended with both of us doing something we'd claimed we wouldn't. So, Eli Sawyer, are you getting in the water with me? Or are you going to spend another 14 months pretending you don't still think about this lake every single summer? There are certain questions that split your life cleanly into before and after. Standing up from that dock felt like one of them. I could have made a joke. I could have reminded her, correctly, that we weren't 17 anymore, and that reckless didn't suit either of us the way it used to. Instead, I found myself pulling my shirt over my head, and she was already laughing, low and surprised, like she hadn't fully expected me to say yes. Turn around, I said. Don't peek. You didn't ask me to turn around 14 months ago. 14 months ago, you didn't leave the country without telling me first. The words came out sharper than I meant them to, and I watched something flicker across her face before she turned obediently toward the water, giving me the privacy I'd asked for, and, I think, giving herself a second to absorb the hit she knew she deserved. A moment later, I heard fabric rustle behind her, then the soft splash of her stepping off the end of the dock into water that had probably been running warm all week under the July heat. Your turn, she called, already 10 feet out, dark hair slicking back as she surfaced. I went in without letting myself think about it further, the cold shock of deep water pulling a startled breath out of me the moment I surfaced. You said this lake was warm in July, I said. It is warm. You're just soft now. Comes from all that indoor plumbing work. I fix roofs, Maren. I'm on top of houses in 90-degree heat 6 days a week. Then the lake should feel like a mercy. It feels like an ambush. She swam a slow circle around me, close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed, far enough that neither of us had to acknowledge it if they did. For a while, we didn't talk at all, just floated in the dark with the wedding tent lights barely visible through the trees on the far shore, string lights her family had put up 2 days early for photos. It was, against every instinct I had cultivated over the last 14 months, one of the easiest silences I'd shared with anyone in a long time. I used to think about this lake more than I should have, she finally said. In Florence. There's a river there, but it's not the same. Too much traffic on the banks. No dock like this. You thought about a dock. I thought about the person who used to sit on it with me. She looked over, water beaded on her lashes, her voice quieter now than the teasing tone from earlier. I thought about you constantly, Eli, and I told myself that was just homesickness, because homesickness was easier to admit to than missing a specific person I'd hurt. You didn't just hurt me. You disappeared? I know. Do you? Because from where I was standing, it looked a lot like you decided I wasn't worth a conversation. She swam closer, treading water directly in front of me now, and there was nothing performative left in her expression. That's not what happened. What happened is I was terrified that if I gave you a chance to ask me to stay, I would have stayed, and I would have resented both of us for it within a year. I didn't trust myself to say no to you, so I didn't give either of us the chance to try. That's not a decision you get to make on my behalf. You're right. It wasn't fair. I've had 14 months to sit with how unfair it was, and I still don't have a version of that story where I come out looking like a good person. Her hand found the dock ladder beside us, fingers curling around the rail. I'm not asking you to forgive that tonight. I just needed you to hear me say it out loud, instead of hearing it secondhand from your mother or the church bulletin. I reached out and rested my hand on the ladder beside hers, close enough now that our fingers nearly touched in the dark water. Why tonight? Really? Not the engagement room. The real reason. She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I thought she might dodge the question the way she dodged so many others over the years. Because I got the offer to run the pastry program permanently in Florence, she said. Full department. My own kitchen. Everything I told myself I left here to find. And instead of feeling relieved, I stood in my apartment and thought about this lake. And I realized I was about to make the same mistake twice, in the opposite direction, by staying somewhere just because leaving felt harder to explain. That landed somewhere underneath my ribs, and I didn't have a clever response ready for it. So you came back to figure out what you actually want. I came back because I already left you once, she said, and her voice cracked slightly around the word once. I didn't want to do it again without at least being honest with you first. I didn't say anything right away. The water moved quietly around us, insects humming somewhere in the trees along the shore, and I let myself really look at her for the first time all night, past the rumor and the years apart and the careful distance I'd been keeping since the text message arrived. I'm glad you told me, I finally said, but I'm not going to pretend that hearing it fixes 14 months. I don't expect it to. Good, because it doesn't, she nodded, accepting that without flinching, and something in her shoulders eased slightly, like she'd been braced for a worse reaction than the one she got. We stayed in the water a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory, old stories, mutual friends, the wedding logistics that had brought her home in the first place. By the time we climbed out and wrapped ourselves in the 2 towels she'd packed, the sky had gone the particular shade of navy that meant 1 in the morning wasn't far off. We sat at the base of the carved oak, her shoulder against mine, both of us dripping and unwilling to be the first to suggest leaving. What happens tomorrow? I asked. You've got a rehearsal dinner. I've got a job site at 7. Tomorrow I stand next to my cousin while she cries through her vows, and you go build somebody's deck, and we pretend tonight didn't happen if that's easier for you. Is that what you want? No, she said, but I also don't know what I'm allowed to want yet. I have a decision to make about Florence, and it isn't fair to either of us if I make it about you before I've made it about me. I understood that more than I wanted to. Take whatever time you need. Just don't disappear again without telling me first. That's the only thing I'm asking for. I can promise you that much. We walked back toward town a little after 1, not touching, but closer than the distance we'd kept on the way out. And when we reached the fork where our paths split toward our separate houses, she paused. Thank you for getting in the water, she said. Thank you for finally explaining the ring. She laughed, soft and real, and for a moment the 14 months between us felt smaller than they had all week. The rehearsal dinner was the following evening, held in the same backyard where the wedding tent had already gone up 2 days early, string lights strung between the oaks and long tables set with mismatched vases full of lake flowers. Bridget's mother had insisted on picking herself. I wasn't officially invited, but Pine Hollow weddings had a way of absorbing half the town regardless of the guest list, and Callum had dragged me along on the strength of a free dinner and an open bar. Maren found me near the drinks table around 8, wearing a pale green dress that made the whole evening feel more complicated than a backyard rehearsal dinner had any right to be. "You clean up well," she said. "I own exactly one shirt without paint on it. You caught me on a good night." I noticed the effort. We talked for a while, easy in a way that surprised me after everything that had happened at the dock the night before, and for a stretch of maybe 20 minutes, I let myself believe the evening might just be pleasant. Then Callum found me near the edge of the tent, pulled me a few steps away from the crowd, and said the thing he'd clearly been holding back since he first saw us talking. "You know she's leaving again, right? Whatever this is, whatever happened last night, she's still got a job waiting for her in Italy, and you're going to be the guy standing at the airport wondering why he let himself believe it was different this time. It's not your business, Cal. It's my business when I'm the one who had to watch you stop answering your phone for 3 weeks the last time she left. I'm not doing that again. I'm not watching you become her safety net every time Florence gets lonely, and then get left behind again the second something better comes along." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit, mostly because some quiet, exhausted part of me had been thinking the exact same thing since the moment I read her text the night before. I didn't have a good answer for him, not one I was proud of, and the silence between us stretched long enough that he shook his head and walked back toward the bar, done saying his piece. I found Maren 20 minutes later near the edge of the yard, and something in my face must have given the conversation away, because she asked what was wrong before I'd said a word. "Callum thinks I'm your safety net," I said. "In case Florence doesn't work out." Her expression shifted, hurt, and defensive at once. "Is that what you think?" "I don't know what I think. I know that 14 months ago you left without a conversation, and now you're back for 10 days telling me you thought about me the whole time, and I'm supposed to just trust that this isn't the same pattern with better lighting. That's not fair. None of this has been fair, Maren. Not what you did, and not what I'm feeling right now." She looked away, toward the tent lights and the wedding party gathering for toasts, and when she looked back, her eyes were bright with something she was working hard to hold in place. "I can't promise you Callum's wrong. I don't have a version of this where I can guarantee I won't hurt you again. All I can tell you is that I'm here, right now, trying to be honest instead of disappearing. And if that's not enough, I understand." I didn't answer right away, and the silence sat between us long enough to feel like an answer of its own, until Bridget's father tapped a glass to start the toasts, and the moment dissolved into obligation and applause. I left the rehearsal dinner early. Maren didn't come after me. Callum found me in the driveway loading tools into my truck the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, and he didn't bother easing into it. "You look like a man who didn't sleep." "I didn't. Because of what I said? Because of what you said. And because some part of me has been thinking it since the second I read her text message." I set a toolbox down harder than it needed to be set down. "You're not wrong to worry, Cal. I just don't know if you're right, either, and not knowing is worse than either answer." He leaned against the tailgate, quiet for a moment. "I don't want to be the guy who talks you out of something good because I'm still angry on your behalf about something that happened over a year ago." "That's not fair to you." "Then why'd you say it?" "Because somebody had to, and your mother wasn't going to." He almost smiled. "For what it's worth, I've never seen you look at anyone the way you looked at her across that tent. I just don't want that to be the only thing you're weighing." I didn't have an answer for him that morning, and I spent the job site hours that followed only half present, measuring boards twice and still cutting one wrong. 2 days passed with nothing between us but a single text from her, sent late Saturday night after the wedding itself. "I understand if last night changed things. I don't want you carrying doubt about me on top of everything else." I let it sit unanswered for most of a day, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted to say back, and Callum's warning kept circling in my head every time I tried. By Sunday afternoon, restless and tired of my own indecision, I drove out to the lake instead of answering the text at all. She was already there. Of course she was. "I got a call from Florence this morning," she said, before I'd even reached the dock. "They need a final answer by tomorrow. The department head is stepping down early, and if I don't confirm, they're moving to the next candidate on the list." The compressed timeline hit exactly the way Callum's warning had. A fast, unwelcome confirmation that the decision I'd been avoiding was now unavoidable for both of us. "Tomorrow," I repeated. "Tomorrow." She sat down at the base of the carved oak, drawing her knees up, looking smaller than I'd seen her since she got back to town. I know I don't get to ask you to help me decide. I know that's not fair after everything. But I didn't know where else to be right now except here. I sat down beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched, and let the quiet stretch for a while before I finally said what I'd been circling since the rehearsal dinner. I don't think you're using me as a safety net, I think I was scared enough by the idea that I let Callum's voice get louder than my own for a couple of days. That's on me, not you. You don't have to say that just because I'm upset. I'm not. I mean it. I turned to face her fully. Here's the truth, Maren. I don't want you to take that job because you're scared of disappointing yourself twice in the same direction. And I don't want you to stay here because you're scared of hurting me again. I want you to choose whichever one actually feels like your life, not a reaction to a mistake you made 14 months ago. Her eyes filled, and she looked down at the initials carved into the trunk beside us, worn smooth now from years of weather and two people's hands tracing over them out of habit. Last time I left, I told myself staying would have meant giving something up. My whole life felt like it was waiting for me somewhere else. And now the only thing that's ever actually felt like home is the 10 days I've spent back in this town. Mostly because of one very stubborn contractor who let me drag him into a lake at midnight. She wiped at her eyes, half laughing at herself. I don't want a version of my life where the only way I can feel brave is by leaving the people I love. I already left you once. I don't want to do it again. I reached out and pulled her closer, her forehead coming to rest against my shoulder, the carved oak steady behind us the way it had been steady for 12 years. So don't. It's not that simple. There's a real opportunity in Florence, a real career. I'm not asking you to throw that away out of guilt. I'm asking you to be honest about what you actually want, the same way you were honest with me on this dock 2 nights ago. I tilted her chin up gently. What do you want, Maren? Not what you owe me, not what you're scared of. What do you actually want? She was quiet for a long moment, the lake settling into its evening stillness around us, string lights from the wedding tent still faintly visible through the trees on the far shore even a day after the ceremony had ended. I want to call them tomorrow and turn it down, she finally said. Not because of you specifically. Because for the first time since I left, staying feels like the brave choice instead of the safe one. I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since Callum pulled me aside 2 nights earlier. You're sure? I'm not sure of much, but I'm sure of that. She reached into the canvas bag beside her, the same one that had carried nothing but towels and water 2 nights before, and pulled out a small folding knife. The same one, I realized after a second, that used to live in the glove box of my old truck. I kept this, she said, a little sheepish. I took it with me to Florence. I told myself it was practical, for opening packages. It wasn't. She handed it to me, and I understood without her explaining further. I turned to the trunk of the oak, found the space just beside our original lopsided heart, and carved 2 words underneath it. Nothing elegant, just honest. Staying chosen. Maren traced the fresh cut with her fingertips, then looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her since we were 17 and certain that nothing could touch us. I already left you once, she whispered. So don't let me do it again. I pulled her closer and said, I won't, but you're going to have to promise me the same thing. No more disappearing when things get hard. If you're scared, you tell me. If you're tempted to run, you tell me that too. I promise. Say it again. I want to actually believe it this time. She laughed, wet and real, and pressed her forehead to mine. I promise, Eli. No more disappearing. Whatever this turns into, we do it out loud, together, even when it's terrifying. We stayed at the lake until the sky went fully dark, and when we finally walked back into town, we walked together, hands loosely joined, neither of us in any particular hurry to reach the fork where our paths used to split. Maren called Florence the next morning while I was on a job site 3 streets over, and she texted me a single line when it was done. Told them the truth, that home found me first. I read it standing on a half-finished roof, and I had to sit down on the ridge beam for a minute before I trusted myself to keep working. Callum apologized properly 2 weeks later, cornering me at the hardware store to admit he'd rather be wrong and watch me happy than right and watch me alone, which was about as close to sentimental as Callum ever got in public. I told him I'd hold him to it. He told me if she ever left again, he was allowed to say he told me so, and I told him that was fair, because it was. 6 months later, Maren opened a small pastry counter inside the same bakery that had kept her name on the specials board the whole time she was gone, and Callum, to his credit, showed up on opening morning with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and an apology neither of us made him say out loud. We didn't rush anything. We went slow on purpose, the way 2 people do when they've already learned what happens, when you don't ask enough questions before you commit to something. But every week, we found time to walk out to Miller Lake. And every week, The carving under our old lopsided heart got a little more weathered and a little more permanent. On the 1-year anniversary of that midnight text message, we drove out to the dock again. Same warm July air, same string of stars over the water. Maren brought the canvas bag, and this time when I looked inside, there were 2 proper swimsuits folded neatly on top. "You brought suits," I said. "That feels like a betrayal of tradition." "I brought options," she said. Some anniversaries call for skipping straight to the part where we actually get in the water. We sat at the base of the oak first anyway, her head on my shoulder, my hand resting over the 2 words carved beneath our initials. I thought about everything staying had cost her, and everything leaving had cost both of us, and how strange it was that the same lake had held both versions of our story without changing at all. If your ex ever asked you to meet them at midnight and told you the truth you'd been waiting 14 months to hear, would you go? And once you were standing there, would you trust it, or would you brace yourself for them to leave again? Tell me what you would have done in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one before everyone else, subscribe to my channel. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.